A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Marley was dead. To begin with, there is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for, well, I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, sole administrator, sole mourner, and sole friend. And even Scrooge wasn't that cut up by the sad event. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. However, there it stood, years afterward, above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, nor wintry weather chill him. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, as if to say, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, poor master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all of human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time. Of all the good days in the year, upon Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather, and the city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, Bob Cratchit, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Now, Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of great imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation Scrooge had of his approach. "Pah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas, a humbug, uncle? You don't mean that, I am sure."
"I do. Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough."
"Well, come then. What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said,
"Pah! Humbug!
"Don't be cross, uncle," said the nephew.
What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer? If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine."
"Keep it? But you don't keep it."
"Let me leave it alone, then. Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you."
"Well, there are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say, Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open up their shut-up hearts freely, and therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded.
"Let me hear another sound from you, Bob Cratchit, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, nephew. I wonder you don't go into Parliament."
"Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow."
"I'll see you in hell first."
"But why? I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?"
"Good afternoon."
"I am sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute, but I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last, so a Merry Christmas, uncle."
"Good afternoon."
"And a Happy New Year."
"Good afternoon."
His nephew left the room, but stopped at the outer door to bestow the greeting of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially.
"There's another fellow, my clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and a family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam."
The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him.
"Scrooge and Marley's, I believe,"
said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list.
"Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night."
"I trust the liberality of his generosity is well represented by his surviving partner."
"At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time."
"Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir."
"Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons." "And the Union workhouses? Are they still in operation?"
"They are still. I wish I could say they were not."
"Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful cause. I'm very glad to hear it. But under the circumstances, under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the unoffending multitude, a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and, well, abundance rejoices. What shall we put you down for?" "Nothing. You wish to remain anonymous. I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I do not make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there."
"Many can't go there, and many would rather die."
"If they would rather die, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Good afternoon, gentlemen."
Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened. The owner of one scant young nose gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. "God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dis—" Scrooge seized a ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, dismounting from his stool, Scrooge tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
"You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?"
"If it is quite convenient, sir."
"It is not convenient, and it is not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound."
"Yes, sir."
"And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work?"
"It's only twice a year, sir."
"A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning."
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge buttoned his greatcoat and walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and, having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, up a yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. The building was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house except that it was very large, also that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place, also that Scrooge had as little of what is called a fancy about him as any man in the city of London, and yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw the knocker without its undergoing any intermediate process of change. Not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, said "Pah!" and lighted his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh! Pooh!" and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for it being very dark. Darkness is cheap, so Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollections of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room? Bedroom? Nobody. Nobody under the table. Nobody under the bed. Nobody in the closet. Nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his usual custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the very low fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. As he threw his head back in his chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated, for some purpose now long forgotten, with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with a strange, inexplicable dread and astonishment that, as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Clang, clang. Clang, clang. Soon it rang out loudly. Clang, 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 and so did every bell in the house. Clang, 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 clang. This was succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. It came on through the heavy door, and a spectre passed into the room before his eyes, and upon coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" Marley's ghost. The same face. The very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots. The long chain he drew wound about him like a tail, and was made of cash-boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he'd never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and noticed the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin. He was still incredulous. "How now?" said Scrooge. "What do you want with me?" "Much!" Marley's voice. No doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Can you sit down?
I can.
Do it then.
Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that, in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it.
You don't believe in me?
I don't.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
Mercy!
Scrooge held on to his chair, but how much greater was his horror when, the phantom taking off the bandage round its head, as though it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast.
Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness that it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness.
You are fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link, and yard by yard I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as the 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
Jacob, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me.
7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and travelling all the time.
No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse, captive, bound, and double-ironed. Not to know that any Christian spirit, working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I.
But you were always a good man of business, Jacob.
Business! Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. At this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. Hear me, my time is nearly gone.
I will, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray.
How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. That is no light part of my penance. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer.
You were always a good friend to me. Thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? Because I think I'd rather not.
Expect the first tomorrow night, when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?
Look to see me, no more, and look that for your own sake. You remember what has passed between us?
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. It walked backward from him, and at every step it took the window raised itself a little, so that when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. He became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings, inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The misery with them all was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost the power forever. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge closed the window, and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And, being from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep on the instant. Ding dong, ding dong. Ding dong, ding dong. Ding dong, ding dong. Ding dong, ding dong. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of the bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber, until suddenly the church clock tolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy "Ga-doing!" Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand, and Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. Like a child, yet not so much like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on its skin. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and, in singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great candle snuffer for a cap, which it now held under its arm.
"Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?"
I am.
"Who and what are you?"
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
"Long past?"
No, your past.
Scrooge could not have told anybody why, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered.
What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap, and force me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?
"What brings you here?"
Your welfare.
"I'm much obliged, but a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end."
Your reclamation, then. Rise and walk with me.
It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that his bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication.
"I am mortal and liable to fall."
Bear but a touch of my hand there,
laying it upon his heart,
and you shall be upheld in more than this.
As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road. He was conscious of 1,000 odours floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten.
Good heaven! I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
Your lip is trembling. And what is that upon your cheek?
Scrooge muttered, with an unusual catching in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he would.
You recollect the way?
Remember it? I could walk it blindfold.
Strange, to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on.
Some shaggy ponies were now seen trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits, and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us. Why did his cold eye glisten, and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other "Merry Christmas" as they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas. What good had it ever done to him? They left the high road by a well-remembered lane.
The school is not quite deserted at Christmas. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still.
They entered a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain desks. At one of these, a boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon the floor and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be.
I wish...
What is the matter?
Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something, that's all.
The ghost smiled thoughtfully, and waved its hand, saying as it did so,
"Let us see another Christmas."
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and still there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms about his neck, kissed him again and again.
"Dear brother, I have come to bring you home, dear brother, to bring you home, Ebenezer. Home, home. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one night that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you, and you are never to come back here, and you are to be a man, and we're to be together all Christmas long, and have the merriest time in the whole world."
His sister began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart.
So she had.
She died a woman, and had, as I think, children.
One child?
Your nephew?
Yes.
That moment they left the school behind them. They were now in the busy thoroughfare of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressings of the shops that here too it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it? I was apprenticed here.
They went in, and were greeted by the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller he must have knocked his head against the ceiling.
Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's old Fezziwig alive again!
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and called out,
"Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!"
Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, came in briskly, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Why, it's Dick Wilkins, to be sure. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, no more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson.
You wouldn't believe how those 2 fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their places. 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em, and came back panting like racehorses. "Hilly-hi-ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility.
"Clear away, my lads, and let's have tons of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer!"
The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made like an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid, with her cousin the baker. In came the cook, with her brother's particular friend the milkman. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. There were dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast, When the fiddler struck up, an old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would become of them next, and when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the two prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop.
A small matter, to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4, perhaps.
It isn't that. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune.
He felt the Spirit's glance and stopped.
What is the matter?
Nothing particular.
Something, I think.
No. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all.
My time grows short,
observed the Spirit.
Quick!
This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again he saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, in whose eyes there were tears.
"It matters little," she said softly to Scrooge's former self. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can comfort you, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve."
"What idol has displaced you?"
"A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have seen your noble aspirations fall off one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?"
"What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement?"
"In words? No, never."
"In what then?"
"In a changed nature. In an altered spirit. If you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? I release you with a full heart, for the love of him you once were. You may, the memory of what is past half makes me hope you will, have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen."
"Spirit, remove me from this place."
"I told you, these were the shadows of things that have been. That they are what they are, do not blame me."
"Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it. Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer."
In the struggle if it can be called a struggle in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, and dimly connecting that with its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form, but though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted, and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and, further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Intermission. I'll be back in 5 minutes. apparently there was a slight problem with you hearing narration out of one side and ghosts out of another. I think I may have fixed that for us, but I'm not positive. But we shall see. All right. Let us return. Just let me do a reverb check. Yep, it's working. Okay, great. Okay. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was once again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness right in the nick of time for the essential purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands and, lying down again, established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and he did not wish to be taken surprise and made nervous. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1, ga-dong, and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. But all this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant. At last, however, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it, and his own adjoining sitting-room, into which he shuffled into his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove. The leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many a winter season. Heaped upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, and great bowls of punch. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in a shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door.
Come in! Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas presents. Look upon me. You've never seen the likes of me before.
Never.
Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these late years.
I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
A tremendous family to provide for, Spirit. Conduct me where you will.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did he was told, and held it fast. The room and its contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerks. Up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Bob Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes and, getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honour of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now, two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had
smelled the goose and known it for their own.
And, basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table.
"What has ever got your precious father, then?"
said Mrs. Cratchit.
"And your brother Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't half as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother!"
cried the two young Cratchits.
"Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are! We'd a deal of work to finish up last night at the milliner's, and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you are come. Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless you." "No, no, there's father coming!"
cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once.
"Hide, Martha, hide!"
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around.
"Not coming,"
said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed. It were only in a joke. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
"And how did little Tim behave?"
asked Mrs. Cratchit.
"As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember, upon Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see."
His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And, while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, which they soon returned in high procession. You would have thought it was the rarest animal in the world, a feathered phenomenon. Indeed, in this house it was just that. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody and crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last, the grace was said.
"For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen."
It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, "They hadn't ate it all at last." Yet everyone had had enough, and the young Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. "Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it," a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. But in half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannon-ball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that, now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob called a circle, and at Bob's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup, without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed.
"God bless us, everyone,"
said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live."
"I see a vacant seat and a crutch without an owner. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. None other of my race will find him here. What then? If he like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population."
Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit.
"Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in your heart, forbear that wicked creed until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child."
Scrooge, overcome by penitence, was startled to hear his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I'd had him here to give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, The children! Christmas Day! It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. Oh, you know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you, poor fellow.
My dear, was Bob's mild answer. Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's, but not for his. Long life to him, and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very happy and very merry, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. But after it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. It was a great surprise to Scrooge as this scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew approvingly. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too."
"More shame for him, Fred,"
said Scrooge's niece. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty. "He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment."
"I'm sure he is very rich, Fred. At least you always tell me so."
"What of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha, ha, that he's ever going to benefit us with it."
"I have no patience with him,"
observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have. And I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner."
"Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner,"
interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast, who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereas Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "I was only going to say that the consequence of him taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his mouldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, and I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now, at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. After tea, they had music. After a while, they played at forfeit, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas. There was first a game at blind man's buff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself against the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. Scrooge begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed, but this, the spirit said, could not be done.
"Well, there's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, Spirit. Only one."
It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something and the rest must find out what, he only answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal rather than a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, the nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter. At last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out,
"I have found it out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!"
"What is it?" cried Fred.
"It's your Uncle Scrooge!"
Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge! Uncle Scrooge!" they cried. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. It was a long night, if it were only a night. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was grey.
"Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near."
The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment.
"Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. "But I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?"
"It might be a claw for the little flesh there is upon it. Look here."
From the foldings of its robe it brought 2 children. They were a boy and girl, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment.
"Oh, man, look here. Look down here."
"Spirit, are they yours?"
"They are man's, and they cling to me. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree." Have they no refuge or resource? Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
The bell struck 12. Gadong! Gadong! Gadong, 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 gadong. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and, lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the air through which this spirit moved it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. He knew no more, for the spirit neither moved nor spoke.
I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with his hand.
You are about to show me the shadows of things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, spirit?
Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it.
I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, will you not speak to me?
It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them.
Lead on, the night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit.
They scarcely seemed to enter the city, but they were in the heart of it, on the exchange amongst the merchants. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen, observing that the hand was pointed to them. Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk.
No, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead. When did he die?
Inquired another.
Last night, I believe. Why, what was the matter with him? Thought he'd never die. God knows. What has he done with his money? Well, I haven't heard. Left it to the company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know. Well, it'll be a cheap funeral, for upon my life I don't know anybody to go to it. I don't mind going if a lunch is provided, but I must be fed. Well, I'm the most disinterested man among you, for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch. Bye.
Scrooge knew the men, and looked toward the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation must lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy, and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem.
"How are you?"
said one.
"How are you?"
returned the other.
"Well,"
said the first.
"Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?"
"So I'm told," returned the second.
"Cold, isn't it? Good morning."
Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to conversation, apparently so trivial. He looked about in that very place for his own image. But another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day, for, being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes. By now they had left this busy scene, and went into an obscure part of the town, to a low shop where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. A grey-haired rascal of great age sat, smoking his pipe, Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop, but she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black. He was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been by his appearance. They all three burst into a laugh.
Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we haven't all three met here without meaning it. What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber?
You couldn't have met in a better place. Let the charwoman alone to be the first, let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did.
That's true indeed. No man more so.
Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose.
If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, wicked old Screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of laying gasping out his last there, alone by himself.
It's the truest word that was ever spoke. It's a judgment on him.
Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We all know pretty well where we were helping ourselves before we met here. I believe it's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe.
Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening the bundle, and dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do you call this?
Bed curtains.
Bed curtains. You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him laying there?
Don't drop oil upon those blankets now.
His blankets?
Who else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say. Oh, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find an hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't have been for me.
What do you call wasting of it?
Putting it on him to be buried in. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again.
This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead.
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. The scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon this plundered bed, and on it, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this plundered, unknown man. Scrooge glanced towards the Phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in this room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think.
"Spirit," he said, "this is a fearful place. In leaving it I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let us go."
Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head.
"I understand you, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power. Spirit, if there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, show that person to me, I beseech you."
The Phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight where a mother and her children were. At length the long-expected knock was heard, She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. "Is it good?" she said. "Or bad?" To help him.
"Bad,"
he answered.
"We are quite ruined."
"No. There's hope yet, Caroline."
"If he relents."
"He is past relenting,"
said her husband.
"He is dead."
She was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so. With clasped hands she prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart.
"To whom will our debt be transferred?"
"I don't know. But before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline."
Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him caused by this event was the one of pleasure.
"Spirit, let me see some tenderness connected with a death, or that dark chamber, Spirit, will be forever present to me."
The ghost conducted him to poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in needlework, but surely they were very quiet. The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face.
"The colour hurts my eyes. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home, for the world. It must be near his time. I think he's walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother. I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed, but he was so very light to carry, and his father loved him so, that it was no trouble. No trouble. And there's your father at the door."
She hurried out to meet him, and Bob, in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, each child, a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." "You went there today, then, Robert?"
"Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is, but you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. My little child."
He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. But after a moment Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked a little down, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him.
"On which," said Bob, "for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, 'I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit,' he said, 'and heartily sorry for your good wife.' It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us?"
"Never, father,"
cried they all. "And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves, and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it."
"No, never, father,"
they all cried again. "I am very happy. I am very happy. Spectre, said Scrooge, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how I can tell. Tell me what that man was with the covered face, whom we saw lying dead.
The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to a dismal, wretched, ruinous churchyard. The spirit stood amongst the graves and pointed down to one.
Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of the things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, but if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept toward it, trembling as he went, and, following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I that man who lay upon the bed?
He cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No! Spirit, no! No, spirit, hear me! I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life.
For the first time, the hand faltered.
Good spirit, your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three will strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on this stone.
Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw the phantom's hood and dress evaporate. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own.
"They are not torn down," cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. "They are not torn down, rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will. Oh, Jacob! Thank you, Jacob!"
"I don't know what day of the month it is," said Scrooge.
"I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby."
Really, for a man who had been so out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. A most illustrious laugh, the father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious! Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog. No mist, no night, clear, bright, stirring, golden day. Scrooge called downward to a boy in Sunday clothes. "What's today?"
"Eh?
"What's today, my fine fellow?"
Today? Why, it's Christmas Day."
"It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits did it all in one night. Of course they did. They can do anything they like. Hello, my fine fellow."
"Hello."
"Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one, at the corner?"
"I should hope I did."
"An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there, the big one?"
"What? The one as big as me?"
"What a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck."
"It's hanging there now."
"Is it? Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the directions where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown."
The boy was off like a shot.
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know. Who sends it?"
As Scrooge went down the stairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man, his glance fell upon the knocker.
"I shall love it all my life. I scarcely ever noticed it before. What an honest expression it has on its face. But it is a wonderful knocker. Oh, here's the turkey. Hello, yoo-hoo! Merry Christmas."
It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped him off short in a minute.
"It's impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab."
The chuckle with which he paid for the turkey and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab were only exceeded by the chuckle with which he paid the boy.
"Cheers, governor."
Scrooge dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets, and Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir. Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge often said afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, these were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his house, his counting-house, the day before.
"My dear sir,"
said Scrooge, quickening his pace, and taking the old gentleman by both his hands.
"How do you do? A Merry Christmas to you, sir. Mr. Scrooge? Yes, that's my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness to make..."
And here Scrooge whispered in his ear,
"My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious? If you please. Not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. My dear sir, I don't know what to say to such generosity. Don't say anything, but come and see me. Will you come and see me?" "I will,"
cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it. In the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock, but he made a dash and did it.
"Is your master at home, my dear?"
said Scrooge to the serving girl. Nice girl, very.
"Yes, sir."
"Fred?"
"Why, bless my soul!" cried Fred. "Who's that?"
"It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?"
Let him in? It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Nothing could be heartier. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first, and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. That was the thing he had his heart set upon. And he did it. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. Bob was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open so that he might see him come into the tank. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
"Hello! What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?"
"I am very sorry, sir. I am behind my time. It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir."
"Now, I tell you what, my friend, I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore I am about to raise your salary."
Bob trembled. and got a little nearer to the ruler, he had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket.
Bob, a Merry Christmas, Bob! A Merry Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Now, make up the fires and buy a second coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was as a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the old city knew, or any other good old city in the world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us, everyone.
The end. Thank you guys for sharing that with me very much. It's truly a privilege to do it and to share Dickens' words that are amazing. If you enjoyed yourself and you find it in your heart, and I know this is a very difficult year for many, many people financially, so please don't feel like you need to. This is meant to be my gift because I've been very lucky this year. There are not many actors working, and I'm very blessed to be one. And I'm very lucky. But there are a lot of young people that aren't. And Ali Forney is an amazing institution. They help LGBT youth who are thrown out and help them get on their feet, help them understand that life will get better for them, and to make a way forward. And I can't think of a better way to show Christmas spirit. So, thank you very, very much. I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.